Start. Question. All right, so we looked at the labor market last time. So we're trying to figure out how we can use some economic tools to make predictions, because we think that there's three goals that we hope our politicians are keeping in mind when they're setting policy. So we mentioned these once before, and I kind of want to try to keep them at the top of our mind, because it hopefully brings us back to why are we looking at different things. So what are the three goals of our economy if we're running this capitalist machine of a fairly free market, although it's not so free with the type of, that's one of the issues we'll talk about more, but this exchange of stuff. What are our three goals from the macro perspective? How about GDP? Do we want it big or small? Big. Do we want it increasing or decreasing? Increasing. So increasing income, increasing real GDP. We learned the distinction of real and nominal GDP. We just don't want it the dollars. We don't want prices higher. We want more quantities. We want more boats. We want more chicken wings. We want more beer. We want more stuff on our island, more outputs, the quantity of outputs. So we'd like to see the quantity of stuff increasing over time. One reason is that our population continues to grow. So we'd like to see it increasing for that reason, if nothing else. What about unemployment? Decreasing. I think we want to be careful with decreasing. Decreasing to what? 0? Down to the natural rate. All right, so we said some unemployment is expected. What type was that? What type of unemployment do we expect in a healthy, vibrant economy? Not cyclical. Not that cyclical is a type, but what's the type that we expect in a healthy economy to continue to have? Frictional, right? So frictional unemployment, kind of the normal churning going on. Structural unemployment dealt with what? Technology, new things coming. People lose jobs because new technologies come along and displace them. Good or bad for the economy? Good for the economy. Bad for the person who lost their job, but from the overall picture, we'd expect there to be frictional and structural unemployment. And so we don't want decreasing unemployment unless unemployment's above the natural rate. But what we'd like to have from a policy standpoint is maybe low unemployment. Might be fair. And maybe I'll add the little caveat here around the natural rate. So the natural rate of unemployment included frictional and structural unemployment. Economists estimate that to be around, what? 5%. You might have some economists even at different times going as low as 4.5%. Typically not higher than 6%. So there's disagreement among economists. It's not something that we can really easily calculate. If we were to add up and imagine trying to collect data on this and say, hi, are you structurally unemployed? And they're like, what? And then you even explain it to them. Did you lose your job because of technology? Did your skills become obsolete? Is that something we can know with certainty? Whether their skills became obsolete, or whether they really were just kind of lazy, whether they had something going on in their life that distracted them, whatever it is, it would really be impossible to know that with certainty. So that is something that's estimated. Usually, I think most economists would be in that 5 to 6% range, probably. Okay, and then prices. What do we want? Riley, you just taking copious notes there? No Clash of Clans or anything going on? All right. What about prices, inflation? What's our objective for our goal for our economy? If you guys were the masters in control here, what do you think about inflation? High inflation or low inflation? Low. Zero inflation? Deflation? You know, do we want inflation that's low but it bounces around every other month from 2% to 8% to 1% to 4%? We kind of like it to be not only low but also stable. So low and stable inflation is generally the prescription that we'd like to have. So that's it. So for the rest of the semester, the rest of the term, I should say, since we're on our 8-week deal, everybody get on this? I want you to kind of keep these things in mind, all from the beginning chapters, chapters 4 and 5. We'd like to have increasing real GDP while maintaining low employment and also having low and stable inflation. What we're going to find as we get into these models is that sometimes there might be trade-offs. We can't have our cake and eat it too, and that's what these models are going to develop for us. So our first of 4 models that we're going to use to look at the economy, our first one that we did last time was the labor market. So we had labor supply, labor demand. The supply of labor comes to us from who? In general, from our households. So the households own all of the resources, and they are supplying them. So one of those is the labor hours. So the supply curve is coming from households, and the demand curve is the businesses that want to purchase labor hours. And so we had labor hours being measured on the horizontal axis. The interaction of these two groups gave us what we call the equilibrium wage and the equilibrium amount of hours being worked. So in reality, the labor market has lots of these graphs, right? If we were to put the supply of computer software programmers, they would have their own supply and demand curve, right? If we put the labor accountants chart up here, then we'd have our own. So there's just a whole bunch of these. So one of the things that gets lost in macroeconomics is some of that detail, which is why we have microeconomics. If we want to study what's going on in the accounting field, then we go to microeconomics to look at that industry or that particular field. So we're intentionally taking a step back and aggregating all of the hours being worked in the United States. What's happened to the number of hours being worked in 2015 relative to 2014, relative to 2005, right? So does that give us something that's helpful? Or is it just kind of mental masturbation? Meaning, it's fun to think about how many hours is going on our island. I wonder how many hours was worked. But at the end of the day, did we spend a bunch of time and resources to add up the number of hours, and does it have meaning? What do we use it for? Sometimes other economists call into question the value of macroeconomics at all. Should economics remain more at a micro level to be meaningful? Do politicians, such as your current president or any other past president, start to think that they have control over something for which they don't? That they can do something to beef up the number of hours or to increase the wage, and all of a sudden they look at these, well, I'm the one who runs this island, And I think if we pursue this type of policy, there'll be an increase in hours. And so they start to have what a famous economist that we'll learn a little bit more later, Hayek called the fatal conceit. The fatal conceit. And that is the idea that people in power think they can do more than they actually can. And so they chase after changes to make something happen when in reality it's impossible. It can't even be done, is what Hayek might argue under the right set of circumstances. Okay, so nonetheless, these things get discussed. One of the reasons we have this class is that these variables do get looked at, and hopefully we can start to understand the implications of some of those with fatal conceit. Since you have to live with people who have fatal conceit, you as an individual micro consumer maybe can have changes in your behavior accordingly to fend off that and to not fall prey to somebody up there is going to figure things out for us. We don't have to work, not fall prey to that line of thinking. All right, any questions or comments there? All right, so I want to bring this topic back to long-term economic growth to kind of wrap up chapter 6. So part of the chapter talks about the labor market, and part of the chapter starts off with what we introduced at the beginning on how Japan in 40 years has come up close to the prosperity of the United States and Hong Kong, some of those exciting topics. So I kind of want to bring us back to that long-term economic growth. What are the key ingredients needed for good growth? And so that's an effort to try to think about goal number 1 is what do we need for long-term prosperity? All right. I want to start you off with a little bit of history, and then we'll kind of work on this question. So there's kind of 3 schools of thought that have evolved over time in economics. 3 schools of thought. Number 1 is classical thought. So a guy by the name of Thomas Malthus kind of came up with this, and he looked at the data in the, let's see, when was Malthus? Late 1700s and maybe early 1800s, a long time ago. He said, you know what? We're all screwed in the long run. Forget about it. And so economics, he coined the phrase, we were the dismal science. The dismal science. And what he thought was true back in those days was that population growth would offset real economic growth. So when we become wealthier and higher incomes, we make babies. And so our income per person is kind of screwed. So if we think about our per capita real GDP, we have real GDP divided by the population, which was the variable that we were looking at last time with the United States being about $46,000 per person. Per capita real GDP. The classical thought here was that population growth will offset growth in real GDP. And that was kind of a dim outlook. Now we start to get a better understanding of that if we think about the world through Thomas Malthus' eyes. Back in the 1700s, what was life like in the United States? What did our island look like if we were thinking about the macroeconomy in the United States? What did it look like in the 1700s? What was going on for economic activity? How did most people make a living? Farming, right? So farming, agricultural, kind of subsistence type living, right? Where you make your own food, that's what you bring to the table. So you can think of our whole economy was really dominated by farming at this time. And if anything, we maybe had really small businesses, small towns. You guys have watched old movies or maybe some old TV shows and kind of got that picture of what life was like on the prairie. It was probably pretty desolate in here through the middle of the United States, and states like Kansas kind of look the way it does now. That's more preserved area, but that was like the whole state, right? It was just pretty barren. And so how did you get labor when you're living as a farmer? What was a good way to get labor for your farming operation? Children, right? You make more babies. So we had big families. We had families of 5 to 7 to 13. Wasn't uncommon because we got to get those kids working. When they're 5, they're doing something on the farm, right? They are working. So that was part of the whole mindset, is that as we start to become prosperous, we're going to have population growth offset it so that we will continue to be at more of a subsistence level living. We don't have those extra luxuries, extra money laying around. We kind of just make our income and eat it. Subsistence level living. Subsistence living. That was the picture for Malthus. Okay, well, what comes next then after we start to get into the deeper into the 17, 1800s? What goes on? Those of you who had a few history classes, even back to high school, what goes on? How does the United States start to transform and look different, moving away from this farming stuff? Industrial Revolution, right? So we start to have more capital, machines start to come in to make people more productive. And so this infusion of machines and capital and technology starts to change things such that we can have real growth per person, that this can actually start to increase over time. So we kind of took Malthus and we said, sorry, you know what? You were wrong. So number 2 is the neoclassical thought on economic growth. And that was that technology, increase in technology leads to an increase in savings and investment. Now, class means what? Does it mean money? Does it mean Wall Street? Stock market, retirements, 401ks, money market mutual funds? What does investment mean in econ class? What type of activity is going on? It's very specific to econ because, loosely speaking, we do talk about 401ks being somebody's retirement investment, but not in econ class. What's going on with investment? Purchases of capital. Capital being machines, buildings, tools, things that help make other things, right? So we've got capital accumulation going on through the increase in technology, which helps drive up the productivity of labor, leading to higher real wages. All right, so this increase in savings and investment can lead to an increase in real GDP per person. And this is capital accumulation. We learned from the labor chapter that an increase in capital leads to an increase in the marginal product of labor. The amount of hamburgers that each person can make goes up. With each individual person being more productive, workers can enjoy a higher real wage. So labor demand movements over time through increases in marginal productivity due to capital accumulation lead to higher real wages. So an increase in real wages. So that just kind of is a snapshot of how neoclassical thought looked at long-term economic growth. The key, I guess, is this. If you're highlighting in your notes, we have capital accumulation leads to economic growth. How do economies grow? We get more machines. From chapter 2, what does more machines do to the production possibilities frontier for beer and pizza? It shifts it out, right? So that is the economic growth. More beer and more pizza. If we have technology in beer production, one of the cool things that we did is if this shifts out like this because we invented a new machine for beer, a reallocation of resources allows us to get from point A to point B. So economic growth, one of the underlying fundamentals is through capital accumulation. All right, questions on that one? Yeah?
What's
LO capital accumulation over here, this thing?
Yeah.
That is my little scribbly real wage. So it's a little W. Sorry. Definitely, anybody, when I do stuff like that, yes, glad you mentioned it. Do it every time. Don't hold back if you don't get some of my crazy writing up there. And that goes for some abbreviations. You know, I'll try to say it as I do it. I don't think I've said this yet this semester. Here's one thing that you should be doing when you're doing your studies or you're reading in your textbook, is when you look at a graph like this, this is not the LS curve. It's the labor supply curve. This is not the MPL. Like our brain sometimes reads that as MPL. I want you to train yourself to say marginal product of labor, an increase in the marginal product of labor. Start training your brain that way, because we're going to continue to use these acronyms all day long. If I had enough time, I wouldn't use these abbreviations at all. But you can see that if I start to go labor supply, I'm an economist. I need that to happen quicker. So in an effort of efficiency, I want to make that just LS. But when your eye looks at it, I want you to say labor supply. And that'll help you, that'll help reinforce the material as we go through chapter after chapter. If you continuously don't say R, GDP, PPF, production possibilities frontier, real gross domestic product, and kind of speak that. Okay. Anything else up here? All right, so one of the rubs against this neoclassical thought is that we still have diminishing returns. Similar to how when we added more labor, as I added the fourth person, the fifth person, remember the diminishing returns is that each additional person brings less and less hamburgers to the table, right? The law of diminishing marginal product. We have the same thing going on with capital. Imagine if I continue to add more and more grill space to a fixed amount of cooks. So if I have 6 cooks, we can look at their productivity. But what if I add another grill and another grill and another grill, but I keep the number of cooks fixed? Then we're going to have the same problem. That's our law of diminishing marginal product. So as we add more and more of a variable resource to at least one fixed resource, the amount of product from each additional unit eventually falls. We have that all written out. I wrote it in generic terms when you go back in your notes and look at that. And so here we're seeing that if we have capital accumulation, we're not necessarily going to see the benefits to that all the time, continuously. So I want to reflect that in our production function. So we got different models to think about. Here's the production possibilities frontier where we have beer and pizza. This is outputs. This is part of real GDP, is being measured on the axes here. The production function that we did, one of the early ones we did on Monday, measures labor and input here and output real GDP here. So here's hamburgers now with labor. So when we start to look at these graphs, your first step should be what's on the axes. Your eye naturally gravitates to all the fun stuff going on in here where the 2 lines are crossing. Don't do it. This is part of kind of training yourself. Here's an economic model. The first thing that should come to mind is, what are we showing a relationship between? And you get that by looking at the axes: labor hours, real wage. Beer, pizza. Labor hours, real GDP. Okay? That's the first step. Then you can start to digest what might be going on in the picture. And so our production function had this shape. Why? That's a good quiz or test or homework question. Why does the production function look like that? Law of diminishing marginal product. Good. So we have diminishing returns. As I add more and more workers, the amount of productivity that each additional worker adds falls. So this picture reflects the law of diminishing returns. All right, if we were to put on some equation goggles instead of graphing goggles, we can express it real generically. And we could say that the amount of output is equal to some function of labor and capital. So this is a generic mathematical expression, and it reads, as we have our equation goggles on, we're going to say real GDP, I'll put this in quotes, real GDP is, kind of comes off the equal sign, a function of the quantity of labor and capital. That's our decoder verbalizing this expression. Real GDP is a function of the quantity of labor and capital. And this is a general function, just showing the arguments. In other words, it lacks details. If we were looking to show the mechanics of it, like what is the actual formula? I plug in 100 people and 3 machines, and I poop out 1,000 units over here, right? If I wanted to do the actual details, bear in mind it would look like similar to this, but we get rid of this generic stuff, and it might be y equals 100 plus 36L plus 6LK minus K squared. I'm just totally making up something here, but you guys have seen this in algebra class a long, long time ago, or some basic math class, some sort of formula where we solve for x or solve for y. But now we've got all these details on it, right? So that if I told you there was 100 units of labor and 6 units of capital, you could plug that into this formula, get your calculator out, and it would poop out an answer over here, right? So this is the formula with the details. So as you go through the text, I think it's first introduced in this chapter, you're going to see the formula in kind of generic terms as we think about technology and labor and capital. So this has an equation behind it. And that equation reflects the law of diminishing returns. So, what does economic growth look like? Well, if there is an increase in labor from 100 units to 120 units, a 20% increase in labor, then this formula tells us that we move from 1,000 units to 1,300 units, perhaps. And again, we're just pooping out numbers from actual numbers now being cranked into some formula that we don't know. But we can use the graph kind of similar to how we'd use the formula if we had to. Now, what happens to this picture, though, if there's an increase in capital from 6 machines to 8 machines? What happens? It shifts. Good. Which direction? How? Up. So if we have more machines, what this production function did is it held fixed the amount of machines at some level. Let's just say K1 equaled 6. It also held fixed technology. Shows the combination, maximum combination of 2 goods given its available. The production possibilities frontier shows the maximum combination of 2 goods given its available resources and technology. Is that what you said? If you didn't, that's okay. So, resources and technology. I thought you said tech. So resources and technology. Resources including labor and capital, and then technology. So if we have a new technology, that shifts out the production possibilities frontier, giving us more pizza and more beer. In this space, bear in mind I've got pizza and beer and lawyer services and dental services all combined into real GDP up here. And so if there's capital accumulation in the country, if there's more machines going out, then if we have 100 units of labor, we used to be able to poop out 1,000 units, but now we can poop out something more. At 120 units of labor, we used to be able to crank out 1,300 units, but now that we have more capital, every unit of labor on average can crank out more. And so economic growth in this picture is shown by the production function shifting up at perhaps K2 equal to 8, or some higher level of capital. And that's how we can get some economic growth. All right, but it's still subject to diminishing returns. Okay, questions on that? All right, so the last growth theory that we're going to look at is called new growth theory. And I think I'm going to erase this. So, new growth theory. All right, so new growth theory kind of came about because we started to see that some places like Hong Kong and Singapore didn't seem to be subject to diminishing returns. And so economists started asking themselves, well, maybe there's more to the picture than just straight capital accumulation being the main thing. So new growth theory better explains the possibility of growth that is not subject to diminishing returns. So example, Hong Kong growing the way we did, the way we showed it, from having $8,000 per person to $46,000 per person in a fairly short amount of time. And so what they focus in on is technology. So technology, what they claim here is that technology slash knowledge, which is what we kind of figured technology really is, just knowledge that's used for the production of stuff, right? So it's information is really all what technology is. So technology is knowledge. Technology and knowledge can lead to unlimited growth. Let me get rid of this one. All right, so here's their thought. Go ahead and draw a production function. We've got real GDP up here, labor here, just like what we did before. And let's say that currently their economy is at point A. It doesn't matter where you draw it on your paper. What is knowledge accumulation going to do? What if there's new technology? What happens to the production function? It shifts up. So we're going to have a similar picture, which doesn't lead to anything different than what we just did. So let's call it 1 and 2. And the economy could experience growth, let's say, from point A to point B. What new growth theory brought to the table is to say, what if the economy is such that we're continuously being impinged upon with new knowledge and new technology? In other words, technology is always growing and evolving. What does that start to look like year after year? And as new technology comes in, now just draw a couple more, we start to get a different picture of the potential for knowledge accumulation that looks like this. And so from a macro standpoint, if we connect the dots, growth is not necessarily increasing at a decreasing rate, the diminishing returns. The actual path of the economy can look like this. From a mathematical standpoint, we're kind of doing this, but when we stand back and look at the data of what Hong Kong's done, they've continued to grow maybe at a constant rate or even an increasing rate in some cases. And so that comes through a different mechanism than capital accumulation, which may have been going on at the same time as well, bear in mind. But it's more through an emphasis of knowledge. So, what are some activities? If the new growth theorists are correct, and we look at these underlying fundamentals, which I like, we go back to the basics of, here is the amount of output we can have given our available resources and technology. What are some activities to promote long-term growth? If we are on our island, are there things we can do to promote long-term growth, knowing that growth can come through capital accumulation, savings, and investment, which was the classical way, but now we've got this idea of knowledge. So what can countries do if we're trying to think of things what we can do, the opening question I gave you, what can we do to promote long-term growth? What are some possibilities that come to mind? Education. So what? Let's kind of dig into that deeper, but definitely education. Think of some countries. How do we get knowledge transmission and education in? It's not necessarily a trivial task, right? What can we do? What does it mean to increase education? Free community college, as Obama put up? Okay, and how can we increase opportunities? Let's try to put ourselves in the pictures we see on TV of some of those countries that they're asking for relief money, right? What do we do in those countries? How can we have stuff going on? How can we bring education? What's some infrastructure that might help promote long-term growth? Let's see, I already got to give Jeff an extra credit point. I got my extra credit pencil here. What are some activities you could think of besides that? So it can add on to Jeff. Somebody other than Jeff, what can you add on? That's good. Okay, like what? How are you going to bring that to the people? So I want you to think of kind of how are we getting that to my country? That might be, okay, teach them how to use it. So through some workshops or something, right? So one of the things we might be able to do is to teach people how to use technology. Now, how well does that work if you're in a country where people don't have this? Although, by the way, that's a growing trend that they do have this. What do you need maybe before you teach them the technology?
Basic skills.
Some of those basic skills, right? So we're going to maybe have skills training. At what age? 9-year-olds? 4-year-olds?
Beginning of elementary school.
Yeah, right down the system. So if we were really attacking this idea of long-term growth in education, we might want to start to infiltrate all levels of education, right? what else can help bring, if we're the United States trying to help a developing country, and we believe these new growth theory people, what else might we want to help that country with a gift? What would you give them? So you're saying give them education. I want you to think a little more about that. What can we buy for them right now that would really maybe start to make a difference long term? Absolutely. Okay, so free trade is something that we'd want to do for them to further. So let's say that we've got the trade on the table, which we've made good strides with, by the way, for the last 40 years. What do we want to give them? What would you buy for them?
Facilities?
Maybe you're a billionaire. Some facilities, right? The library. A lot of these countries don't have anything like that. So maybe the facilities that has now, maybe instead of being full of books, what is it full of? Computers, computer stations, iPads. We could buy that instead of giving them food. And you might ask, well, how are they going to eat? I don't know. Maybe they'll figure it out. Maybe somebody else will give them food. But maybe we should take the lead in giving them this and giving them some food. Maybe we can do a little bit of both. Instead of taking a $10 billion gift, maybe $5 billion of it should be in that type of stuff. A physical building. Maybe some internet communications type infrastructure, right? So all of a sudden we start thinking about how can we really provide and promote long-term growth. How can we beef up the human capital? There might be different ways that we can do that. So education might be buildings with computers, otherwise known as a library, but they're all mostly e-books, perhaps. Maybe we can start to give them their own devices, their own iPads, so that if they come to the school, they don't actually have to come inside the physical building. They can just be within a certain radius like we do on campus. Start to provide that sort of thing. Okay. So when we think about education, the new growth theorist people did some studies and found that there's other ways to do it besides our American mindset of K through 12 education. We got to get those kids in school and go to it. It could be at a much lesser level, perhaps. Skills, on-the-job training, different things like that can do it too. Oh, do you have something?
I remember it was this last topic. They showed that people are learning faster in other countries.
That people are, no, it wasn't in this class, I don't think. So what?
They learned at an earlier age. Like there were, a little boy over here was getting tutored by a girl in India. She said that kids that she was tutoring in India were learning 2 years in advance what he was
Getting in our system, yeah. Yeah, our that kind of would get us too far off topic, but yeah, I think our system is potentially riddled with issues of our construction, or not construction, conveyor belt mentality of, well, when you're 5 years old, you enter kindergarten, and then you just progress right through the system, and we kind of have this conveyor belt mentality of how we plow kids through K through 12. That's education, right? And that type of thinking came about during the Industrial Revolution when Ford was starting to come up with the assembly line, and we kind of thought of it as a processing thing. And these developing countries are in a different position because they didn't have a lot of that same infrastructure. Some of them had the British imperialism kind of went around to India and different places, and they kind of put their education system in place. But in other remote areas, we can just kind of start them learning wherever they're at and let them accelerate at whatever pace they can do on their own. So there's kind of some neat differences that might be able to be taken advantage of. Okay, other questions or comments there? So hopefully this education is one aspect that then leads to discoveries of new technologies. All right, so this education, training, skills leads to discovery of new technology. And again, it might not be a new machine, but maybe new methods. Might be new inventions. New avenues for trade. All kinds of stuff. New discovery can lead to these increases. Kind of exciting stuff. All right, so we really have two ways then. This new growth theory, by the way, doesn't dismiss the neoclassical. We can still have, through savings and investment, capital accumulation as well. So both of those go hand in hand. All right, questions or comments there? All right. Discovery of new technology can sometimes be a double-edged sword, though. What's awesome about information is that it can be spread quickly to a bunch of places that might lead to increases to everybody. But why might that be bad in a market system, too? That new discoveries, new information can be spread quickly to other people. From the market standpoint, what's the incentives for individuals to discover new technologies, individuals and businesses? Let's kind of stick to businesses with this, would probably be the easiest way to grasp onto it. Okay, a market advantage. So you discover a new method or a new invention or new process, and if that method gets spread out everywhere, are you going to reap the benefits from it? Not all of them. You'll still have some benefits, but not all of the benefits. And so that ends up being kind of a double-edged sword, is that information is valuable to you and to others, but incentives might not be such that we are actually encouraging the discovery. So we've got a problem. Since information can be spread and enjoyed by many, this is the good for society. Since information can be spread and enjoyed by many, that's great for society. That's where we get into the, maybe there's no diminishing returns here. There is a, this was supposed to be a continuation of the sentence. There is a disincentive for business to invest in new technology. Invest in in discovery of new technology. What we call research and development. So there is a disincentive for business to invest in discovery of new technology. People will just steal their great idea. So if we're trying to come up with a new drug for cancer, I might be reluctant to spend money on that Because if I do, because this can be very costly to hire scientists to kind of push the envelope and highly skilled people if we hit a bunch of dead ends. If our chances of hitting the home run that saves the world is 1 out of 100, is that where I want to spend $20 million? That's a tough decision, right? Now, it might be if they can recoup that. So we can look at the small chance of discovery. If the information can't be copied, then we might have a chance at having the private sector do it. So, info being copied makes it hard for business to make a profit and justify the high cost of R&D, research and development. What is our response to that, at least in some part? What does the United States have on the books that some other countries don't? Patent laws, right. So we do allow companies to have a monopoly on a particular thing that they came up with through our patent laws. Those are limited, though, to, does anybody know how long? Those of you at Micro, we talked about this, I think. 17 years. So you've got 17 years to be able to figure out how to make money on your invention, because as soon as that 17 years is up, everybody can make a knockoff drug. We can go out and copy them. All right, so that's a tough one. That's not easy to find answers to. Before we can start to have education, these guys are heading off to basketball. We have to have some other things in place for the market. And so I want to spend a little bit of time looking at the Economic Freedom Index. A graduate of Ottawa turns out to have been pretty influential around the world. I'm going to try to do this with just the overhead. You guys might have trouble remotely seeing this, but the class is going to have trouble too, so you guys are on here. All right, so Jim Gwartney is a graduate of Ottawa University. He was a student of Wayne Angel's, and he went on to get his PhD in economics. He's down at Florida State University right now, and he, 30 years ago, did some research and came up with an index of economic freedom. So he, like other economists, were puzzled why Hong Kong did so well when they were doing so crappy and it only took 40 years. You know, how did they do it? What are the ingredients needed for long-term growth? And so this kind of left some fertile ground for economists to do some research on what exactly makes countries grow and what doesn't. And so he came up with this concept of economic freedom, because what came up when we looked at the list of countries is that these were countries that seemed to have some basic things in place. Basic things of property rights, which we take for granted in the United States, but simply the right to own stuff. You can own a house, you can own a car, you can own property. Historically, kings and queens owned everything, and the rest of us own nothing, is kind of the traditional way that things went. But we have property rights, which then allows people to save part of their money. So if they can own property and they can own assets, then they can save for the future. So he took stuff like property rights and maybe corruption in the government. I'll kind of list some of this stuff, and made a number. So over to the right here is the number that he's calculated on a scale of 1 to 10 of where countries rank with economic freedom, the freedom to do things in a country. So at the top of the list is Hong Kong at an 8.97. So that 8.97 doesn't mean quite as much unless you start digging into the details of where that number came from. But it's a compilation of a number of different variables. Singapore is next. Now, where's the United States on here? You especially that are closer, you can see this a little easier. You guys with eagle eyes. 17 in the world is the United States. Now, what's interesting is some of the countries that are more free, according to Gortney's index on economic freedom, Estonia, Taiwan, Denmark, Jordan, United Kingdom, Chile, Australia, Canada. When he did this stuff back 10 years ago, I can't remember what date it was or which year it was. This is 2011 data here. The United States was like 7th. At one point, we were 3rd in the world in terms of economic freedom. So what we've seen happen in the United States is that we've been dropping down the rankings, while other countries like Switzerland, which a lot of people perceive to be a little more socialist than the United States, they might even have something like national health care, right? Things that seem to be not as free. It turns out when we dig in deeper into the amount of government regulation and laws and other things, they're less restrictive. And they favor personal property rights. And that ends up having them climb the rankings. Okay, so that is a little bit of a glimpse on the world. Let me give you actually I'm going to make a printout of this later for you. Here is the 5 areas that make up this number. Oh, by the way, we didn't even get to the good part here. Let's go down to the other, the lower quartile of the world. At the bottom down here, we've got Venezuela, Myanmar, the Congo, Zimbabwe, Chad, Angola, Burundi, Congo, Ethiopia, Algeria. Okay, so a lot of countries. What's interesting is if we take a look at the map of the world, and he's got these color-coded, we can start to see where these poor areas are. The countries that are less free tend to be the poorest countries in the world. And so that's the connection that the case that Jim Gortney helped the world start to see is that economic freedom leads to better prosperity. The countries that are in the top quartile over here are what would be more of the richer countries around the world. Okay, let me go this and then I'll open up for some questions. Here's his components of what goes into the calculation. So the size of government, government consumption, transfers and subsidies, government enterprises. So how much stuff does the government own? Like, do they own the rail system? Do they own the oil in the country? That was Venezuela as an example of that. So what is the size of the government? So he has some of these variables that he collects data on. In the United States, does anybody remember from chapter 4 the size of the government relative to our $15 trillion GDP of all the income in the nation? How big was G from C plus I plus G plus X? Approximately. Does anybody remember? 80%, 5%, 50%? 70 was consumption by households. That was the largest one. So our cigarettes, C plus I plus G, that G category is about 20% roughly. 20% in the United States, meaning that 20% of our income is being spent by government or transfers and subsidies. And so that's been, if we look at some graphs of that, which we'll do I think later in the course, government spending has been going up and up and up and up the last 40, 50 years as well. So the larger government becomes of the system, the less prosperous or the less economically free, because we have other people controlling us or controlling our money rather than us choosing. So the idea of economic freedom is having individuals be able to do that. Questions on size of government? So that's one of the categories. 2, legal system and property rights. Courts, impartial courts, protection of property rights, military interference, integrity of the legal system, reliability of the police. Right? That's a big problem in a lot of those poor countries. We've got a corrupt legal system, and so that's going to count against some of the people in terms of economic freedom, some of the countries. Number 3, sound money. We're going to spend chapter 8 talking about the money growth and inflation and how that works in the country. Sound money. How stable is our currency and our system on how people trade, because money is used as the medium of exchange. And so if we have a country that's built upon trade and exchange, we need a good, stable system provided by the government with currency. Although it doesn't have to be provided by the government has laws on the books that says they get to be the currency. Now, who's familiar with some bitcoins? Anybody used a bitcoin? Ever bought or sold anything with a bitcoin? Dirk, you have? Do you have some now? Do you own some bitcoins, or do you have a stash of bitcoins? Or
Well, it's invested in Amazon right now, but yes.
okay, so you've done it before. You've used some transactions. So bitcoins are a privately provided currency. Kind of cool. It's pretty wacky. Maybe we'll have some time when we get into the money chapter. I'll talk a little bit more about how that works. But here you've got a currency, the Bitcoin, which is provided by no government at all. It's a privately produced currency. And that's something weird that hasn't proven itself to be the next thing that's going to take over all currencies, but there's some potential there. All right, so freedom to trade internationally. So Joe brought up international trade. How many taxes? We learned from chapter 15 what a tariff is the tax on imports. If you have high tariffs, then you're not going to score as well on Gortney's index here for economic freedom. That's going to count against you. And so the lower your trade barriers are, the higher your economic freedom. You as an individual have the freedom to roam the globe for the cheapest thing you want to buy or whatever you want to buy, right? You don't have that freedom if the government has imposed barriers to trade. So that's going to alter your score with that. And then finally, section 5 here is regulation. Credit market regulations, ownership of banks, hiring, minimum wage, hiring and firing, centralized collective bargaining, business regulations, administrative costs, bureaucracy costs. You know, how much stuff does the government make me report as a small business owner? That can be intrusive and can be a restriction on how much business I can do if I have a bunch of legal costs to run my little small mom and pop shop here on Ottawa Main Street. If I have the government saying, well, you got to tell me this, this, and this, and you got to make sure that you're following environmental code this, and do you have the smoke detectors in the right spot, and the bathroom's the right size, and the toilet height's the right thing, and you know, how much of that goes on within the country? So he's come up with some ways to measure that, to quantify that for all the countries in the world. And so that you can imagine that's a pretty monumental task, right? To take an inventory of all of that data for every country in the world. This has been a huge project. So he's kind of a famous alum of certainly in economics. He's known around the world for creating this economic freedom index. Okay, questions or comments on the index? As we start to think about the United States, what type of country do we want to live in? Is it a good sign from the data here that we've slipped from ranking of 7 up here with Finland down to 17. By the way, I do know the 2012 or 13 ranking now is 19. We slipped again a couple notches in the ranking. You know, is that a good sign for the United States? Not in terms of some things, right? So, good data to think about, and we'll do a little bit more with the Economic Freedom Index later. I just wanted to introduce it first here in this chapter since we talked about long-term growth. It's not good enough to just have education. We can't just throw schools at these third world countries. We actually have to start with those 5 things. You have to have solid property rights, a non-corrupt government, stable money. If you have those ingredients, now you can start to feather and butter in education and training programs and whatever. But all of that is for nothing if you train people how to do something and then they get their paycheck and they can't use it. They can't save it. They can't do something with it. They can't build a business because the basic fundamentals of capitalism and the market system aren't in place in that country. And those countries just tend to stay poor year in and year out. And they just stay in poverty. Most of the continent of Africa is that way because we just haven't been able to get the right ingredients in place for them to see economic growth. I think we're starting to turn the corner. I think we're going to start to see the whole world raised up. World poverty, since Jim started doing this thing, and I'm not saying it was solely due to this, there's lots of economists that have worked on this, but world poverty has been reduced by 36% over the last 30 years. So we're talking about people who, the dying of starvation type thing, raising the bar, not through relief efforts, those almost have failed every time, but through infusing some of these economic fundamentals into the country. Okay, so let's see, what else we got here? We've got lots of data and stuff like that. I think that wraps up what I wanted to talk about for that chapter. I think I will bring this up. This is kind of interesting, just to give you one different angle on the real wage. Where would you rather earn $50,000? In Kansas City or San Francisco? Kansas City, right? So we can look at the real wage at a slice in time. The real wage we've been talking about is inflation over time, right? So is my $50,000 in 2015 making me better off relative to my paycheck that I was getting back in 2011, right? So inflation over time was how we did the real wage here. But we can also think about my effective real wage in terms of where you live. So here is another index known as the cost of living index. And this particular one focused in on median household income. And what was interesting is that Des Moines, Iowa, which is where I lived here the last 20 years, this is my 4th year now in Kansas, but Des Moines was at the top of the list of places to live because of that. The cost of living index, remember how we had the index was at 100? And if you're below, that made it more favorable. Basically, earning $56,000 in Des Moines is, in general, like earning $62,000 in terms of what can go in your shopping cart, right? Because the cost of living, because the prices are different around the country. And so these are also some other ones that look good. And the bottom of the list, we've got some places in California. I know we had We got some Who's the California people in here. California? Is that you, Vinny? No?
I'm from Dallas.
You're from Dallas, okay. Well, I think Dallas is on here too, actually. There's El Paso. So, median incomes, and here's what it buys you. Now, take a look at New York. $62,000 is the median income. Look at what that buys you. That's your real wage. When you're making $60,000 in this area of New York, you're really earning $35,000 worth of stuff. In other words, you should be careful about this when you're out on the job market looking for a job of where you get placed. So be careful. Like I had when I went to a conference, this guy said, "Hey, we got a job opening. Would you like to come here?" Well, it was in Malibu, California. Now you're like, "Ooh, Malibu, California. That might be a nice place to live." And maybe my paycheck would be 20% higher than what I'm making here. And then I'm like, ooh, gosh, I'd get a raise, move to Malibu. And then I find out the cost of living index probably looks something like this. And so I got a 20% nominal bump in pay, but my real pay might be less than what I'm making in Ottawa. Right? Depending on where you go, depending on the cost of living in these different areas. So San Francisco is a super expensive place to live too, and so there's some different calculators you can get online if you're looking at different places to live. There's lots of data out there. So that's a different way of looking at the real wage at a slice in time, depending on where you live. All right, questions or comments there? All right, so let's start talking about some savings and investment. So, chapter 7 is going to look at the capital market, which this has been a good segue to that because the classical economists said that capital accumulation is good. If we have more machines, we're more productive, our real wages go up. So our chapter 7 stuff looks at that in a little bit different way, and that is the loanable funds market. All right, so Chapter 7. Basically, the whole chapter is kind of on savings and investment. So, the classical economists said that if we can raise the bucket level of capital, the stock of capital in our nation, if we can have more capital, will lead to long-term economic growth, is what those classical economists are saying. And so how do we do that? What is the flow that makes the bucket get bigger? What is that called? Investment, great. Who said that? All right, extra credit time. Nice and loud too. I heard it. It wasn't this little muffled. Okay, who are you again? Kayla?
Yeah.
Last name?
Wood.
All right. So good, investment. So as we buy more machines, the amount of capital starts to rise. There's a hole in our bucket though. What's that? Depreciation. Did I hear Dirk say that first? All right, extra credit point. Depreciation. Great. All right, so the balancing act of these flow variables over a period of time will ultimately change the bucket level. All right, so in order to explore this, we're going to look at the loanable funds market. The loanable funds market. And I'm just going to put the mechanics of the graph. We kind of did it a little bit before. We're going to have a demand curve, the demand for loanable funds, DLF. Demand for loanable funds. And the supply of loanable funds. Now let me pause there and just make sure we got the fundamentals. What's another name we could call the demanders of loanable funds? What would you call those folks? Investors, consumers, possibly. So the demanders for loanable funds, they could be consumers. So who are the DLFers? What are those consumers doing? If they're a member of the demand for loanable funds, they might be consumers, but they're doing a particular thing. What are they doing? If they are demanding loanable funds, those consumers are doing what activity? Before they get to consume, what are they doing in order to pay for their good? They are borrowing, right? Borrowing money. So the demand for loanable funds is made up of borrowers of loanable funds. So who are the DLFers? They are consumers that are borrowing. In other words, their paycheck wasn't enough to cover their consumption. So that's a special group of consumers. That's not every consumer. Who else is a DLFer? Now that we got one off the charts here, who else is a DLFer? Businesses, good. Businesses. And what type of activity are those businesses doing to be a DLFer? They are selling shares. So selling shares, you mean like the stock, the ownership of the company? So selling shares of stock does raise funds, but are those funds borrowed? No, they're not. So they're giving an ownership of the company. So there's other things that they do. So one of the things that the companies are doing here, if they're a DLFer, they are doing what activity? Borrowing. Right. That's all I'm looking for here, is that businesses that are borrowing. What are they borrowing for? Stuff like what? Give me some examples. Capital for, like what types of capital? Good. Machinery, additions to their buildings, new computers, all kinds of stuff, right? So that's typically what they're borrowing for. There might be other activities that they're doing too. They might have to hire some contract laborers, some professionals, some attorneys, or something like that. So there might be some borrowing, a mix of labor and capital. But in large part, businesses borrow funds long-term to fund big purchases of machines and buildings and other types of equipment, plant and equipment. Who else is a DLFer? Government. Good. So government. What activity is the government partaking in if they are a DLFer? Borrowing, right. Now in the government's case, why are they needing to borrow? What didn't happen that forced them to borrow? What caused borrowing? Not exports, because the exports we're going to leave towards, unless we're Venezuela and we're exporting oil or something, but if we're owning industries. But that's not the primary thing for the government. Exports is going to be more of the private sector of businesses doing that. Not high enough GDP? That's not too bad of a problem, but what did that cause? If GDP wasn't high enough, let me play out that one a little bit. Is the GDP the government's money? No. Right? So we got to be careful with that one. GDP is all of our incomes from all of the resources. So what type of activity caused the government to have to borrow? Or activities? There could be a couple plural things here. A little louder? War, okay? And so what caused them to borrow? You don't have to borrow to go to war. But you likely borrowed to go to war. A lot of countries do borrow to go to war. So what caused the borrowing? Overspending or not enough taxes. Remember the flow thing that we have? The government is funded, the government's activities in our market system come to us either in the output market or the resource market. The government collects money down here through taxes like income taxes. The government collects money up here through sales taxes. And then they spend money. They spend money on weapons of mass destruction. They spend money on unemployment checks cut to people, right? So if they don't collect enough taxes to cover their spending, they need to borrow. All right. So governments that are borrowing funds, and then we'll add on here that government spending was greater than tax collections that year. So Todd was bringing up GDP. If GDP is income, which it is, and we have an income tax, then if GDP is low, then our tax collections might be low. So that could cause problems and force us to borrow. So we've got consumers, businesses, and government all on this list. Okay, that means everybody in the economy is a potential DLFer. So that's a little bit unique that we had before. Remember when we had the labor market? Households were the supply curve, businesses were the demand curve, right? So we kind of had their roles this way. In the loanable funds market, we've got all of our agents, is the economic word, all of our economic agents in here are potential borrowers. Okay, well, who are these SLFers then? What are they doing? Who's an SLFer? Consumers. Good. How are consumers an SLFer? They put money in the bank. So that particular consumer is also a little saver. They consumed, so if they had $100 worth of income, maybe they consumed 90 of it, and they spent, or they saved $10 of it, right? So over here, we have our savers. So consumers that are saving funds. Who else is on the list? Government. Now, not the same government. They can't be in two pieces. But if the government has tax collections that are greater than spending, by the way, something we don't see in the United States very often in the last 40 years. If tax collections are greater than government spending, then the government is effectively saving money. There's excess funds there that they're going to have to do something with. Guess what Congress normally votes to do when tax collections are greater than spending? What's their usual knee-jerk reaction to a situation like that? Spend more. Oh, we have more money to spend. Whew, luckily we had some left over. Now we can help the needy and feed the poor and acquire more weapons to blow up the world and all kinds of fun stuff that we can figure out what to do with if we have the luxury of having tax collections greater than government spending. But potentially the government's a saver, and then of course businesses could also be a saver. So all of these three parties partake in all of these activities. And so that can make it difficult for us to kind of navigate through the chapter. And so what I want to look at is, from a macro standpoint, who wins? In other words, from a macro standpoint, are there more consumers that are borrowing than saving, or vice versa? In other words, are consumers net savers or are consumers net borrowers? Is the government, over time, are they mostly a saver or are they mostly a borrower? Are businesses mostly borrowers or are they mostly savers? So we're going to take that macro look, add up all the activity of these agents, and now we can start to see who plays the primary role over here on the DLF and the SLF curve. All right, so on the whole, we have the borrowers being businesses. So businesses end up being net borrowers. For the United States, the government typically has been a borrower, which we'll explore the impacts of that. So business and government, I should say U.S. government, not every government runs things like the way ours does. So business and the U.S. government, for our purposes, are going to fall mostly into the demand for loanable funds. And lo and behold, you probably wouldn't have guessed this, that consumers or households are, and let's use the word households instead of consumers here. So households are net savers overall. Some consumers, especially people your age, consume more than their income, right? You guys go into debt when you're 20-something. On average, you guys are borrowers, but there's somebody on the other side, grandma and some other people that are starting to earn some money. They are savers, and they tend to outweigh your spending. And so, from a macro perspective, household savings funds business borrowing. Kind of leave the government out. The lion's share of this is business, so I want you to emphasize this. So savings and investment is the name of the chapter. Household savings is the primary contributor to business investment. So that's really our players in aggregate in the loanable funds market. All right, questions or comments there? All right, so down on the horizontal axis, go ahead and add loanable funds. Loanable funds. And on the vertical axis, we're going to have the real interest rate. I'm going to write it all out this time, but I just use little r. The real interest rate. There's that word real again. When we hear the word real, what has been sucked out of the variable? The effects of inflation, right? So there's been some sort of adjustment made to the variable for inflation whenever we see that real term. All right, so with this one, we have the real interest rate. And we want to think about borrowing and saving money and how inflation would work with that. So it turns out to be kind of a different looking formula that's kind of nice and simple. So it's given to us by a guy named Irving Fisher. So I call it the Fisher formula. honestly, I can't remember if your textbook gives credit. I think they might in a small note here to Irving Fisher. He's kind of an interesting character. During the Great Depression era, or prior to the Great Depression, during the 1920s, he's kind of a genius type. Was a professor at Yale and did inventions. He invented ivory soap, I think, and so he was kind of one of those inventor genius dudes. And he figured he had the stock market figured out in the 20s. And so he gathered not only his personal fortune, but the fortunes of his families and loved ones that knew he was the smartest guy on earth, and I'm just going to put my money in with Irving. And then the stock market crash of 1929 happened. He lost it all. He lost all of his family's wealth, and that drove him insane. And so then the stories that went on is that into the 1930s and 40s, and as he lived out his career on Yale, every once in a while he'd just walk around the campus naked. So, so much for those types that know this stuff. So anyway, naked Irving Fisher came up with this prior to going crazy. It is the Fisher formula, and it shows the relationship between the stated interest rate, or the nominal interest rate, and the real interest rate. So little r again is the real interest rate. And little I we'll use again. This is the nominal interest rate. Same thing we did with nominal and real wages. The nominal interest rate. And then pi, as we've been doing, is the rate of inflation, the inflation rate. So, for example, if you put your $1,000 into a bank account and you earned 10% interest from the bank, what this says is that what you really earned was something less if there was inflation. So if the interest rate was 10% and inflation was 3%, this quick little formula tells us that you really earned 7%, 10 minus 3. Now, in what way, shape, or form, though? Because I put in $1,000. At the end of the year, if I earned 10% from the banker handed me how much? If I put $1,000 into the bank and the banker told me I was going to get 10%, at the end of the year, how much was I holding? $1,100, right? $1,100 if I earned a 10% rate of return. Dr. Fisher tells me that I really only earned 7%. Why? I still had $1,100. The value of the dollar over time. When I take my $1,100 to the store, I can only fill up my shopping cart with 7% more stuff than I could last year with the same amount, right? That's the power of it. What did I really get in terms of the purchasing power? That's what this contributes. All right, we'll see you on Friday.